This is Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance in Los Angeles. Today we are joined by Brandon Castillo. He's with the No on Proposition 53 campaign. As you know, there are 17 statewide propositions on the ballot. 53 is one of them. It's a bit esoteric, but important to discuss. Let's back up a bit so we can explain this for our audience. If we want to pass a tax that is statewide, let's say a school construction bond, for example.
Correct.
We have that on the ballot this year.
That's right.
By what margin does that statewide school construction bond need to pass?
50% plus one vote. All statewide measures, whether they're general bonds or taxes, require 50% plus one.
If a local school district wants to pass a construction bond, how much does that need to pass?
There's two options. They can pass by 55% if they follow the rules of the Proposition 39, or some require 2/3 vote. But most local districts are passing by opting for the 55% option.
If we want to pass a tax, let's say to fund transportation projects locally, here in Los Angeles County, we have Measure M, R2, whatever you want to call it. What does that need to pass?
2/3, 66%.
It's a little complicated, but
just
important.
A little bit.
But I think it's important for the point of our
Correct.
conversation.
Yes.
If an entity wants to take out bonds, let's say to build a toll road in Orange County,
Correct.
or to build a water tunnel in the Central Valley, today, do we need to go to the voters?
If they're funded using revenue bonds, no. And the reason is that revenue bonds, unlike general obligation bonds and taxes, they aren't a tax on the general fund. They are repaid by users. So the Bay Bridge example is repaid by the toll users, and that is the revenue source. General obligation bonds put debt on the state of California. The state makes a promise to repay it. Revenue bonds, on the other hand, the private investment community bears all of the risk. So if those bonds, for instance, should default, the private investing community holds the bag, unlike general obligation bonds where the state is required to make the payments, and that's why we require a statewide vote.
But if the entity is a public agency, LADWP,
correct.
Help me, what happens then?
It's still private investors. So when you look at a revenue bond as a local entity, and you say, I want to build a water storage facility in Los Angeles, for instance, that entity gets together with the private investment community. They identify a revenue stream to repay it. In the instance of a water storage project, water users will repay it. The private bondholders say, okay, that's a risk I'm willing to take the risk. They float the bonds, they back the bonds, they take the entire risk of the bonds that are repaid by a user stream, not general tax dollars, and the general fund of that underlying entity, whether it's the state or the county, they don't have a call on general funds to repay.
So we don't go to the voters when we're in that situation.
Correct.
LADWP does not need to go to the voters when they want to build a storage project.
If it's going to be repaid by users,
exactly.
Correct.
Okay, so let's talk about Prop 53. Prop 53 would change that model. Without telling us why you don't like it yet, we'll get there, I promise. What would Prop 53 do?
Prop 53 would force a statewide vote, a statewide election, whenever the state or local entities called joint powers agencies want to issue revenue bonds above a $2 billion threshold. It would require a statewide vote for these projects.
So when would a state, because if it's the, I see, the private entity is buying the bonds from the state, so it's their risk.
On behalf, that's right.
It's their risk.
The private investment community backs the bonds.
So give us an example of when a state, California, or a county, or water district, or airport district would want to issue a revenue bond.
Here's an example. The water storage project that I gave you.
Right.
The Metropolitan Water District may partner with local cities and counties, and they form joint powers agencies. They identify a need. We need water storage.
Right.
They identify a way to pay for it. We're going to build this project, and we are going to sell the water to our water customers.
Right.
Those rates will repay the bond. They go to the investment community and say, okay, we have an investable project. We have the payers who are going to use the water and use it, and the private investment community says, sure, we'll underwrite it, we'll take all the risk, we've identified your revenue source, we think it pencils out, and that way the private community floats the bonds and they're responsible at the end of the day for those bonds.
So the proponents of 53 want us to go to the voters.
They do.
For a statewide project or even a local project. So if LA County or LA DWP wanted to build a water storage site, they'd have to get approval from Butte County?
That's right.
And the other 58 counties, is that right?
And that's one of the major flaws in Proposition 53. They excluded cities, counties, and special districts, which is complicated, but they included what are called these joint powers agencies, which are local governments coming together, essentially. So it would be the DWP coming together with the County of Los Angeles or the City of Los Angeles.
And is that common?
It is. It's very common. For large projects, for large regional projects like water storage, like bridge tolls, these JPAs are there are hundreds of them up and down the state that finance infrastructure.
So how would this impact Prop 1, which was the water bond that passed in 2014, $7.545 billion? Because will there be JPAs that are trying to build?
That's one of the.
Not bad.
That's right. That's good. There are two projects that we've identified that are actually fighting for the Prop 1 funds. They're water storage projects. There's Temperance Flat and Sites Reservoir. You've heard of them.
They're the
big ones.
Yeah,
there's been a lot of work that's put in, and those are joint powers agencies. The local cities and the counties and the water districts have all gotten together and said, okay, this is our plan. Now, part of the funding is going to be Prop 1 money, but that's only about half of the funding for these projects. The other half of these projects, they have to repay from water users. They're going to look to water users and say, we're getting new water, we're going to sell it to water customers, and so we're going to repay our portion of the bonds through revenue bonds. So in those instances, you have Central Valley water users who are going to finance this project. They now have to go to voters in San Diego and Marin County and Redding and say, please approve a local project that you don't pay for and you don't use and you don't care for. It's a fundamental fraud in this measure.
So what about statewide, though? If the state of California wants to issue revenue bonds for a water project, earthquake protection project, talk us through that.
That would also, under this measure, require a statewide vote. And so another flaw we've identified is it's going to add new layers of bureaucracy and delays to these projects. It's already difficult enough to build infrastructure in California. Now having to go to the voters, wait 2 years, it opens up an opportunity for people to block a project. It just adds more delays to infrastructure development. So it does include state projects and also local projects.
So let's presume passage. I know you don't want to see that. What vote would be needed to pass a revenue bond? Is it 50 plus 1, 55, 66, and da-da-da? Do we know?
It would be 50% plus 1.
Okay.
Yeah, all statewide votes are 50% plus 1.
Right. So I think we did a good job talking through this, but it's complicated.
It's very complicated.
And so how do you message this? I mean, let's talk, politics.
Sure.
How do you message this?
Well, to be honest, this is why the measure's so deceptive. The proponents are out there saying, hey, we should vote on these projects. Right? Who doesn't want to vote on projects without explaining the underlying fundamental problem? But we know that while voters like to vote on everything, voters in Los Angeles don't want Marin County and San Francisco being able to veto their projects. Voters in Sacramento don't want San Diego saying whether or not we can expand our freeways, build a university campus, build a water storage facility. And so when we're out there talking to the voters and we get behind that veneer of, yes, I want to vote, and we tell them, well, wait a minute, do you want San Francisco rejecting your local project to Los Angeles and vice versa? People take a step back and they say, well, this doesn't make any sense.
His name is Brandon Castillo. He is with the No on Proposition 53 campaign. That election on November 8th. I'm Brad Pomerance in Los Angeles. It's Local Edition.